Before I get started, I'd like to say what a great turnout today. Loads of new faces and some familiar faces, which is great. So TDI seems to be going from strength to strength, which is brilliant. As I've just said, I'm not going to do a lot of talking today. I'll try not to. I'm just going to introduce the event, this session, and then do some sort of closing remarks after Keiran's going to do the bulk of it. But I thought it'd be useful to give some sort of context to why we're talking about data standards here today. Since I've been working on data in the department for about 2 to 3 years, data standards constantly comes up. When I first started the job, going around speaking to everybody, stakeholders, to find out about what the issues were with data, why people weren't sharing data, data standards always came up. I was at a TDI event, and someone stood up, did a presentation and said, oh, we couldn't find any data standards, so therefore we invented our own. And then somebody, perhaps in this room, sort of said, well, actually, which has spoken to me, because there's loads of data standards. And someone new to this area, I was a bit confused about what the truth was. I was hearing loads of different stories about data standards, people saying that all the standards exist, don't need to do anything, to the fact that we need DFT standards with a DFT stamp on and saying this is the way to do it. Also, it's clear to me as well, there's lots of misunderstanding about what standards exist, but also what standards are. I think there's a kind of belief that standards are specifications, but they might not necessarily be that. It could be just a way of doing things or a way of sharing data. We commissioned some work a while ago, about 18 months ago, from some consultants to look at actually why people weren't sharing data, big data, and why we weren't getting the benefits from big data and the Internet of Things. And one of the key barriers cited was around data standards. And interestingly enough, that was 4 transport ministers ago, which says quite a lot. So to try to get some clear steer on actually what the situation was regarding standards, we commissioned the BSI, British Standards Institute, to map out what the data landscape actually looked like in the UK, as like what the baseline was. We also asked some strategic questions about actually, are these standards fit for purpose in a future mobility context? As you know, transport is changing quite rapidly, and are the current ways of doing things, the standard practices, fit for purpose? Also, what should the departmental view be on these standards, and what's the UK's position regarding data standards? Do we want standards to be sort of derived internationally and sort of done to us, or do we want to influence that debate and actually try to steer the direction of those standards and to be a leader and to support the future mobility programme? Also, I should make some caveats. The work that Keiran is going to present is still work in progress, and it's not been seen by our ministers as yet. They've had a few other things to do. So our intention is to publish this work at some point in the future, hopefully in the near future, but I can't give you a date on that. But I thought it was a good opportunity to highlight this work is coming and the fact that we are thinking about data standards and show some of the interesting findings that are coming out of this work. And to have to understand what the truth might be around standards. So over to Keiran.
Okay, thank you very much, Matt. And I'd just like to start off with just saying that I'm really interested to see this grouping of people around the table here under the Transport Data Initiative. In a previous life, I used to work a lot with an interdisciplinary government panel called MEDIN, which was the Marine Data Information Exchange, where we had offshore wind industry, we had power companies, we had fishermen, environmentalists, all coming together and saying, we need to share data and we need to understand how we can go about doing it. And it's interesting to see a number of the issues sort of like resonating through these different communities. Medin is still operating. It's been operating for about 15 years now. So if you ever go to medin.org, you'll be able to sort of like see other work that's been happening in cross-government initiatives. So when we're approached by Matt to have a look at this work, we tried to look at some patterns that had engaged from other communities, all trying to work together with the same aim of sharing data. So when Matt approached us, he wanted us to look at, we believe that the future mobility is limited by data interoperability and a lack of being able to do it. And we think standards are a key part of that. Can you investigate for us and get to the truth position? Now, there's really two things I want to pick out from this slide. One is, if you want interoperability, it's important that the people providing the data and people receiving the data understand what is actually being said and what is actually sort of happening in that space. And the other key point to point out is that interoperability is limited as much and probably more by the policies and procedures in place than by the technical standards that are often sort of like jumped to as the first sort of like step about sort of like data interoperability. And with, with so many actors all working together, the propensity for silos to develop and persist is, is almost sort of like incumbent upon the space, really. So, having a look at this, we worked with a number of group of experts in this place to say, look, okay, we've got this thing called future mobility. What needs to happen from a data standards perspective? And we had a long discussion about what we mean by future mobility and what would actually it look like. But in order to get a bit of focus on that, we worked on one agreed use case. And this use case looked like this. It's, I'm a family, I want to go from Leeds, I want to go to the Jorvik Viking Centre. What would that look like in a future mobility context? And we had 3 outputs from that. I can't read it because I haven't got my laptop here with me. But basically, the idea is I'm offered a number of different options. I can choose the one that I want. And importantly, the destination is part of my journey. So I'm not just buying a travel, I'm buying a travel to get to somewhere. And based on that particular use case, we decided to look at, well, what is it that stops that being realised? So we broke down the factors in what was actually happening. And we'd agreed that in investigating this, certain topics would be in scope. And as you can see from here, we've got topics relating to, obviously, the format and the structure of data standards, which is one thing we often drill down to a lot, but also looking at wider issues about how industry works and how industry operates. We also agreed in investigating this, we'll take out certain things. So these things are excluded from when we looked at standards, as I say, not because they're not important, but because these are generic things around data exchange, and we don't want to get bogged down in trying to resolve those issues. We want to just look at those that are focused on transport. And these are the topics that came out as areas where there are potential sort of like barriers. And we've segmented there as the things that operate at an industry level, down to the sector level, and the sort of like the data level as well. And with these, we use these particular identification of barriers to say, well, if these are the barriers, what standards exist within that particular space, so we can see what best practice is there. And that's really all standards are. It's just a simple agreed way of doing things. And if these are barriers and there is no agreed way of doing it, then clearly there's a standards gap. But it may well also identify that the standards are there, but they're just not being followed. So with searching our rather extensive standards databases, we identified over 1,200 standards that could be used to cover all those aspects of future mobility. But they're covering quite a diverse sector of aspects. So, for example, yes, the core data exchange, physical standards you would, physical data standards you'd expect, API standards, but also standards around intellectual property right management, standards for how you engage new entrants into an emerging market, standards about how you look at allocating roles and responsibilities along a supply chain. So there's a whole breadth of standards out there that all touch on different aspects of how we'd want to realise a future mobility space. And we locked everybody in the room. Looks not remarkably dissimilar to this particular room, to actually get some validation on that. Is this actually what you see as the sort of what's actually happening in that market space? And from that validation, we came up with a number of conclusions and recommendations. And the first one is that essentially data interoperability is not limited by the existence of technical data exchange standards. They are there. It's limited by awareness of them and uptake of them. But the standards are there. They're in development, or if they're not quite right yet, there's active development communities in place. Recommendation sort of like number 2. I can't even remember what that one was actually, so excuse me. Yes. It's limited by the lack of usable, it's primarily limited by the lack of usable data set. Exactly, yeah. So the point there is the fact that although the standards exist, the issue is that data sets are not being realised in order to create those particular sort of like data sets. And there's a number of reasons for that. Simply, the data's not being collected, or the data's being collected and not being published, or it's being published and there, but it's not being made widely and accessible. So coming back to the point made earlier about lack of accessibility to data sets, that resonates quite well with the conclusions on the data strategy. And the third point is that the immaturity of the market is quite a big limiting factor. The market's not going to drive necessarily the right behaviours if it's not quite clear how the market should work and how the market should operate. So, for example, I'm not going to invest in a huge amount of data cleansing activities if it's not clear what ownership rights I have in that data and therefore how I can actually use them sort of like going forward. So, and these are the sort of like the 3 main findings. So what does that mean from how we can improve things sort of like going forward? So we looked at future mobility purely from a sort of a value chain perspective. If this is going to be delivering value to customers and to sort of like users, and at the bottom of this we have the kind of core sort of like data processing chain, taking the raw data, delivering services to customer, and the sort of like enabling services along the top, how does this overlay with the recommendations? And as Matt said, this is still pending DFT approval. So the first one is what we call this future mobility framework, simply getting a way that clarifies how people work and how people operate together to deliver integrated transport services. It came up time and time again that people were unsure, particularly where liabilities vest when you are delivering an integrated transport service. And that comes back down to the people supplying data into that service. Recommendation 2 is we called it data ontology, but this widens out the discussions that we're having here about transport data. Well, what do we actually mean by transport data? What are the types of transport data? When we talk about parking data, do we mean number of car parking spaces, number of car parking spaces available, number of car parking spaces available to peak time, average use of car parking spaces, multiple different types of parking data, but delivering very different use cases. And when you've got those different use cases, what standards should be used in order to make that data available so other people could reuse it? So that's the ontology sort of recommendation. Probably the biggest area, probably the biggest sort of like recommendation comes this what we call this data advisory panel. It's recognizing that we need to get a better way of pulling through the data and having it reused amongst all the actors in this. And this came up again, it fits in with the sort of question, the presentation that Giuseppe was making, is we need this concept of shared use of data, but recognizing there's value to be sort of like made from it. How does that look like? If we've got data sets that are languishing in silos, how can we unlock them so they can be sort of like reused for the benefit of all actors and not just on a sort of like a piecemeal basis? The fourth recommendation is we need to tie this all together some way, and we need some level of interaction, and this probably reinforces the role of what we're looking at from the sort of like the TDI, but we need to get that input from what's happening on the ground, the various activities that need to take place in order to inform what goes into the ontology, what data needs unlocking, how do we prioritize the actions sort of like moving forward. And of course, all these things are integrated together. There's various places where they lock, so obviously the community will inform what goes into ontology, and the ontology will then also inform what needs to be part of the advisory panel. So I just want to talk about each of those recommendations just in a little bit more detail, just to sort of like wrap up. And yeah, the last bit is the sort of like the governance model that sits between them. So recommendation 1, this FOM framework. As I say, it's simply a way of actually describing how we need to work together as actors in this space. I mean, it's quite, topical with what's happened with Thomas Cook. When things have gone wrong, there's a mechanism in place to pick it up there for consumers. If you're starting to sell integrated journeys to customers on a routine basis, if that integrated service is not being fulfilled, or for whatever reason it sort of like breaks down, where do responsibilities lie within that in the value chain? And this is the biggest thing with people were talking about when we had the discussion around standards, are saying we haven't got the reference by which how we should operate to deliver these kinds of services. The second one, the ontology. And as I said earlier, it's about sort of like describing the different types of data that's available. And what we've looked at here, we were working on 3 broad classes of data. Data around the transport, data around what we call the journey, and data around the sort of like the contracting aspects of that. The important thing is when you start to look at this from a standards perspective, is that when you look at the data standards, you've got 2 main sectors. So this sort of vertical turquoise band is showing that there's masses of standards out there covering the generic aspects about how you exchange data. In the top sort of right, there are lots of standards out there, active standards being developed that's covering the transport part of the ontology. So how you describe infrastructure, how you describe the sort of like travel, the travel resource we called it. So effectively, the bus moving around, or the sort of like train journey. When you start to look at the concept of the journey itself, and this is probably more important to the consumer, things like data sets on how that journey can be modified, whether it's like the weather we've had today, or whether it's obscure events. The effect of the journey. Is the journey having the intended benefits? If you're having a future of mobility, what are the benefits we want to get out of it? Is it a net, is it carbon reduction? Is it happier commuters? That sort of data sets don't seem to be being routinely sort of like collected, and those data sets are integral to demonstrating the value of what a future mobility of space would look like. So the ontology would help build that up, get consensus and agreement about what are the types of data we actually need to have to make this a reality. The data advisory panel, as I said, this is about just unlocking the data we've had. Now, really on those 2 diagrams, I'm just sort of really showing that, you can create a kind of infrastructure simply by sort of like getting your data and just kind of lobbing it over the fence into the right area, and you will create a infrastructure of some kind. The point is, if it's uncoordinated and without some level of guidance, you're going to end up with a pretty rough kind of infrastructure. When you start to get a little bit of top-level guidance in there, you end up with something much smoother. I mean, a good example of that is probably the telecoms market, where the government have set how this needs to operate, how it needs to work, and you've got various private suppliers all coming in, working within agreed practices and delivering reasonably sort of seamless integrated service, but with an element of competition at the same time. And lastly, community. There are quite a number of communities out there, all looking at different aspects of transport and data. We probably need to look at a better way of how we can look at more detail on the sort of like the data, sort of like the data issues, pulling together what's happening, not just from this community, but other communities looking at wider aspects of mobility-related data. So those are the sort of like the four sort of like recommendations that are going forward. As Matt says, it's still subject to sort of like validation. We are continuing to do a little bit more work with Matt now, just to do a bit more research into some of the things that this particular study has sort of like thrown up. But I think the intention is looking at Matt, is we are trying to look at getting published towards sort of like later end of this year, depending on what minister we have in place to sign things off, really. Yeah, which is another limiting factor. So, a bit of a whistle-stop tour. I apologise, actually. I thought there was going to be a laptop here so I could read off my slides. So I've had to do most of that from memory. So I apologise if it wasn't quite as slick as it could be. So, thank you all very much.
Okay, do you want to take a couple of questions?
So I'm happy
now?
to take questions from Matt as well.
Yeah, we got microphones. Question over there.
Thanks very much. Jonathan Raper, Transport API. 100% endorse all of that. Brilliant. But we needed to know that in 2014. That's the problem, because that infrastructure has been built. So, for example, we run a quarter of the country's bus rail apps from Transport API, and that's already in place with APIs and a whole sort of tiered sort of delivery. So my question to you is, how do we retrofit what you've got in mind?
Do you take it on that, or shall I?
I'll start.
You're the implementator. I just.
Okay, finish.
I can chip in if you want to.
Well, one of the reasons.
We'll take the hard questions later.
Yeah.
Well, one of the reasons why it wasn't done in 2014 is I wasn't there, nor was Giuseppe or James was there. If we were, we might have done it. And thank you for your support for this. That's really encouraging. I think.
Do you want me to go first?
I just think. Yeah. Do you want to? Well,
I can do
some
it.
thinking.
So, I think with the
Actually, can you use the microphone for the benefit of the people who are live streaming?
It's a good question, and what I want to say is that when you are evolving any sort of like infrastructure, data infrastructures being sort of like taken forward, you are always going to have established parts and sort of like players within that system. It doesn't mean that you have to throw out everything that's been done before in order to work forward. It's more of a case of looking what you've got, seeing what works, and seeing how it can scale, how it can sort of like evolve upwards. So, for example, if there's already infrastructure in place covering aspects of that, the question is, how do we want it to scale? And I think there'll be all kinds of discussions along the lines of how do we want to maybe increase sort of like diversity in the marketplace? How do we want to have situations where we've got seamless coverage between different suppliers? So, for example, again, I come back to the telecoms industry. If I don't want to work with Vodafone, I can go across to sort of EE and I can get the same service out at different sort of package levels I want. I would foresee that this framework maybe moves into that area, allowing maybe suppliers of these middleware services to maybe differentiate on different terms, maybe spend less time having to do sort of like cranking and data cleansing if the supply chain is better aligned, and offering more at the kind of value end to the consumers, and that starts to become the mechanism. So I see this as more as a platform that allows the incumbents to then move upwards rather than anything that brushes anyone who offering these services.
Why don't you do what has happened in other sectors and have a request for technology process where you ask people who are already delivering to bring their technology to the table, and then you can have a process to decide which of those those technology sets is recommended, and over a period of time you can get some alignment, and also, of course, that means that it creates a level playing field with the biggest technology providers that are out there. I just think you need a plan for retrofitting like that one, otherwise it will remain, as an aspiration.
I think that data advice panel covered.
Yeah, I think if we comes back to the BSI recommendation around having a data standards expert panel to consider things like this. Because if we had something like that back in 2014, if we had a more of a active transport data community, these things would have been spotted earlier. So I'm not saying these recommendations we would endorse necessarily, but if we did have something like that, that as a way that the sector is developing quickly, is to prevent that kind of thing happening again.
I mean, it's interesting. Over the coffee, I was talking with someone about the Transport Data Revolution report that came out of the Transport Catapult in 2014, and it was an excellent report that I think is still as valid today as it was then. My own background is in the telecoms industry. I lived through the days when we started off with, various national standards and then emerged to European and then global, And like you were saying, Keiran, we didn't start with a blank sheet of paper. We started up with different companies, all with their own offerings in the marketplace, and we found ways to launch initiatives that brought the industry together to share their expertise and work out methods that came to a win-win, that overcame the problems of monopoly and that kind of thing. So I mean, I would endorse, I think, what's been said there. I think bringing people together is the way to do it.
Before we hand over to Nick for a question, it's also worth emphasising that we have been speaking to other sectors and learning from them, such as fintech and healthcare, and to learn how they've done it, and telecommunications.
When I was in government, which is becoming an increasingly long... Oh, Nick Carey, by the way. Becoming an increasingly long time ago, the received wisdom was that government was absolutely rubbish at building IT, and the Government Digital Service was founded to change that, but it said, look, where it's a government's own service, we are best placed to do it, and we'll get an SME market in to help us. Done a great job. It's fantastic. This sounds more like a nationalisation philosophy emerging, that we're actually going back to sort of government owning and controlling data sources. That sounds quite worrying.
Thank you for that question. That's really helpful, because that's not the case. So if we've given that impression, this is the chance to
and even if it was, you haven't endorsed it yet.
No, exactly. Yeah, I might have said that once or twice. The way I look at it is there's almost a spectrum on this, is the fact that actually you can have no standards at all, no standards at all. You could just leave it to the market, and potentially that has, benefit that is 1,000 flowers bloom, or it could be quite chaotic. The other end of that spectrum is the fact that you have what I call the sort of dictatorial approach. DFT says you will follow this standard. I think that would be wrong. It would create lots of certainty, but it's not future-proof. So you just basically cut out all the innovation, and that would be such a bad idea, because even in normal times, you spend about 2 years getting it through Parliament to do the regulation, and by the time you've done the standards, it's out of date anyway. So why would you do that? So what we're looking for is like kind of a middle way where we work with the community and maybe this expert panel, and to actually how you move things forward, going forward, to help onboard new entrants and develop the standards. So it's kind of industry doing it, the sector doing it for itself, rather than DFT saying this is what you're going to do, and then DFT using its convening power, maybe facilitate it through some funding and all that kind of softer stuff, rather than saying this is what you need to do.
That's very reassuring, and I tell you what, you have a brilliant model, which is one of the most polite and considered models in the world, which is, believe it or not, the internet. Now, I know that the public internet appears to be very impolite often, but actually the things that the internet runs on are RFQs, requests for RFCs, rather, requests for comment. And they're amazing, because actually they're kept very, very conservative. They only release something. It's a bit like the Wikipedia model, where everyone tips in, everyone contributes, constantly peer-reviewed, and that's how our email standards run. Everything runs like that. It's brilliant, because industry and government, everyone participates in a very open way. I commend it to you.
Good point. Thanks for the question.
Same approach with the mobile standards too. All the 5G standards, reflectors, email reflectors are open and so on.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Andy Radford from Birmingham City Council. Probably just a minor comment. All the examples you had were mostly from the public transport side of things, where obviously you've got competition in the transport operator space and you've got a direct relationship with the consumers. I was just going to pick up that obviously roads is slightly different from that, and I noticed Datex is on there, and it's just a plea to make sure that's adequately represented, because they don't all quite match.
Yeah, thank you. So I think you mentioned this, I can't remember if you did at the beginning or not, the fact that there's a separate work being done in parallel with CCAV, Centre for Connected Autonomous Vehicles, which BSI are doing on standards for CAVs. This is intended to be multimodal.
Yeah.
So it just happens to be a public transport example. Yeah. But thank you for that clarification.
It's fine, and it's probably all that. I mean, I'm really, obviously we're working on the DFT open data projects. A number of us have got projects in the room, and obviously we're looking at things like UTMC and how that all kind of fits together. And it probably fits into that model, but just in a slightly different way, just because of the way the market works.
And it's also worth noting that we are working with the Future Mobility Zones and the LAMP project, Local Authority Mobility Platform project, which the Connected Places Catapult are doing for us, and to make sure the standards are taken into account in that. So the idea is to be totally multimodal. I think the difficult with data generally is actually where do you stop and where does transport end. So we've got to draw a red line around it somewhere, but it's going to be a lot more expansive than perhaps we gave the impression. So thank you.
I think that's going to be even more the case as DCMS go into the detail of a national data strategy, because by definition you're going to want to be moving data across these traditional silos.
In an ideal world, that all the data would be interoperable across the transport system, and then the transport system with other systems. So you have like systems of systems. So the fact that the transport data can talk to building data, smart infrastructure data, you can mesh it with environmental data. So all these kind of systems talk to each other. Yeah. In an ideal world.
There is a standard for that.
Yeah.
Any other questions? Any other questions? Goodness me, you got away lightly with that one.
Excellent.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you.